Diplomacy. We start now at 11 and we will run this seminar until 12:15. Let me just also remind you that this seminar will be streamed. Now, my name is Ulf Sverdrup. I'm the director of NUPI. It's great to welcome you here, and not least, it's great to welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill to Oslo and to Norway. He just landed. He flew in from Warsaw this morning, landed at Gardermoen, and it's great that you can be here. He is currently the Dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and he has, as you know, a most distinguished diplomatic career. He was, among other things, the ambassador to Macedonia, to Kosovo, to Poland, to Korea, and also to Iraq. He was the Assistant Secretary for State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He led the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on North Korea. So he has been very much a key figure in some of the critical developments during the last, let's say, 20 or more years. In negotiating the Bosnia Agreement, the Dayton Agreement, the Kosovo crisis that later led to the NATO intervention. He's been a key figure in the negotiations with North Korea. And through that, also, of course, an important figure in the relationship between the US and China, I presume. And he also oversaw the national election in Iraq. So we have a lot of things to talk about today. And I should also mention that, as many of you know, Christopher has also written an excellent book. It's called The Outpost. Very much acclaimed view of diplomatic Frontlines of American Diplomacy, and I would say also a book on the difficulties and challenges of diplomacy and the limits to diplomacy, perhaps. So we have, as I said, a lot of things to talk about. We have asked Christopher today to reflect upon two issues that I think occupy a lot of us. The first is, what kind of foreign policy could we expect from Trump? There's no more than 100 days since he entered office. His team is not yet fully in place, and there is still uncertainty as to the direction and how he will manage some of the key crises that we see on the horizon. So that's the first issue. Secondly, we have asked Christopher to reflect also on one of the other key topics of the day, the North Korean issue. What is really at stake? What kind of solutions could we see, if any, and what kind of scenarios could we expect? So it's great to have you here, Christopher. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to, first of all, to get up to this beautiful city and this beautiful country, and to be here in this really quite world-renowned institute that has, I think, addressed problems throughout the world for so many years. We don't necessarily have a solution to all these problems, but I think we've certainly at least figured out what causes some of them. I've just come from Poland this morning. In fact, I'll go back to Poland tonight, another country where I served for a couple of times. But being in Poland, maybe I will start off with a little anecdote that I always like, which I think speaks to the contemporary scene as well, which is there was a Polish party first secretary many years ago named Władysław Gomułka, a name that's probably at this point lost to history. And Gomułka was known for very long speeches and not particularly successful metaphors. And one day he stood in front of a crowd in the southern Polish city of Kraków, and he said, "Comrades, just a few years ago, our fatherland stood on the very edge of a deep abyss. And I'm here to tell you today, comrades, that we have taken an important step forward." So when I think of the issue of looking at this new administration in Washington, and especially some of these issues that are out there, notably the Middle East problems, but of course North Korea, which is where I think I'll focus, it is important not to take that important step forward, but rather to reflect on where we are and what we need to do about it. I think it's fair to say that President Trump was not elected president on the basis of his expertise in foreign policy. He was, however, elected president on the basis of a lot of frustration in the United States that somehow our foreign policy had led us into areas that were not really issues that directly affected our national interest, and had led us into questions that really were not really germane to what our country needed to do. Trump came in with this kind of view of foreigners that is a deeply embedded view in the United States, the notion that globalization is bad and that overall our engagement in the world represents not so much an engagement but rather an entanglement in the world, and that somehow we need to extract ourselves from these issues and kind of cut them down to specific problems that might affect our national security. Trump, as many American politicians have done before, has completely conflated the issue of national security, of international engagement, and of military strength, and essentially has looked at the military dimensions of these issues and felt that that is where the U.S. has somehow been lacking under the Obama administration. It is way too early, really, to write the history of the Obama administration, but I think there's certainly a perception in the United States, and it was this perception that did help get President Trump elected, a perception that somehow Obama was weak, and that in this weakness, the world has become an even more dangerous place than it was before President Obama was elected. And now we will have a very strong president who will not be weak, who will take decisive actions on issues and somehow protect the United States by his decisiveness. But I think as President Trump has come into office, he's found, and he's actually said this on a couple of occasions, that these problems, lo and behold, turned out to be more complex than he thought they were. It is rather amazing to have a senior politician, let alone a president, said, well, you know, after 10 minutes, I realized there was more to this issue in North Korea than I thought. And, you know, for many professionals in Washington, these are kind of astounding thoughts that somehow he didn't know about its complexity. And when you combine it with the fact that not knowing about complexity, you combine that with the fact he didn't seem to want to learn about the issues. There is, to put it mildly, a kind of lack of intellectual curiosity. And so when you combine those two things and then combine still a third element, which is his view that somehow he has an instinct for these issues that's far more on target than the rest of us have, and that he can use this instinct to overcome a lack of knowledge and a lack of experience. So when people act on instinct, that can be good for a basketball player who might know to go left rather than go right or something. It can be a little worrisome in foreign policy, because I would argue that being hard to predict can be a good thing in, say, sports. It's not necessarily a good thing for the, as we call our president in the United States, the leader of the free world. In fact, right now there are a lot of jokes in the U.S. that, to the effect that when Chancellor Merkel came to Washington, one of the newspapers said, it's great to have the leader of the free world meet the United States president. So there's a kind of a sense that things are very different right now. Now, I think it is fair to say that we have a president who won't admit to learning anything because he believes that everything is kind of derived from himself. He doesn't need to learn stuff. He already instinctively understands these issues. And yet, I mean, we're seeing a president who is trying hard to figure out what to do with about problems, and really not to, and a president who doesn't really want to look to the past as being, as being anything to study in order to react to future events. So we had, with respect to North Korea, the vice president go to South Korea and to Japan and say the era of strategic patience is over. And so this, of course, had a lot of people wondering, well, what does he mean by that? In fact, everyone loved that expression. The new Secretary of State, Tillerson, used it. Trump has used it. No more strategic patience. So people were wondering, well, are we now going to have strategic impatience? Or are we going to have tactical patience as opposed to strategic patience? What does this mean? And the answer is no one really knows, because I'm not sure Vice President Pence or President Trump or, frankly, Secretary of State Tillerson knew what they meant, except to say that they know that this North Korea problem is not going away on its own, is growing in seriousness, and may well be a problem that the American people will become extremely conscious of come the next election in 2020. So I think the president has decided he wants to make this a big issue now, to try to address it, and address it in the sort of transactional mode that he's used to from his private sector engagement. And yet he's not really sure what to do, and he's not really sure how to do it. So the first thing, you recall, President Trump doesn't like to acknowledge the things he said in the campaign were not quite right. So in the campaign, he said, let China do it. This is China's problem. Give it to the Chinese. So he doesn't want to say, whoops, that was a mistake. We're going to have to be more engaged on this. So he does want to double down on a campaign promise. Now, I might add that one exception to what I've just said is that we have not heard him again say that we need to give nuclear weapons to Japan and South Korea. That seems to have stopped with the campaign. But certainly the idea of let's work more with China is something that he has picked up from his own campaign and now wants to engage in it. But he's realized that when China looks at North Korea, they see a far more complex problem than when Americans look at that North Korea. Now, it's very customary in U.S. newspapers to say China's worried that if they put pressure on North Korea, the system there will collapse, and you'll have lots of refugees coming out of North Korea that could destabilize China. This is kind of a typical sort of critique of why China has not done more. But in fact, when you start looking at you know, let's say all 22.8 million North Koreans went north rather than where they probably would go is south, you realize that 22.8 million North Koreans probably aren't going to destabilize China or cause a huge problem in China. So you have to sort of think about whether that's really the case. And so when you start going into it a little more, you realize that there are, as President Trump acknowledged, some complexities to this. For example, when China looks at neighboring states, and this, I'm talking about the last 2,000 years of history, which is a chunk of history. I mean, you have to respect 2,000 years. They don't necessarily see other sovereign states in a sort of 1648 mode. They see tributary states. They see states that somehow are there to sort of be respectful and, in fact, pay tribute to the Middle Kingdom. So when they look at these states, they have trouble. The Chinese have trouble dealing with them as equals. But then when they look at these states, they have trouble thinking that the U.S. alliances with some of these states is anything different than their own view of these states. So when they look at South Korea, they not only do not see a separate sovereign state, they see what is really happening is the U.S. has its own tributary state called South Korea. And so when the Chinese think, well, if North Korea goes away, South Korea could become the successor state, and that would put a U.S. tributary state right up on the Chinese border, and with CIA listening posts on the Chinese border. And this would be broadly understood within China as a victory for American strategic interests, a defeat for Chinese strategic interests. I submit to you that that's a far more active concern within Chinese thinking than the idea that they're worried about refugees should all 22 million North Koreans decide to leave and to leave by going north. So has the U.S., is it possible for the U.S. to try to allay Chinese concerns about this? I think it is, but I think it's going to take some serious effort on the part of the U.S. to reach the Chinese and have a deep dive as to what our interests are in with North Korea or with succession on the Korean Peninsula and what our interests are not. For example, I don't think you would ever see U.S. troops up on the Yalu River. I don't even think you would ever see listening posts up on the Yalu River. I think from the mood in the United States, it would be difficult to keep even the troops in what is today the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. I think it would be even difficult to keep those troops there. There'll be a lot of people saying, why do we have troops there? And in fact, Donald Trump has himself raised the issue, why are we there protecting South Korea when they're not paying for it? In fact, he's wrong. The South Koreans are doing a lot to pay for it. But secondly, he's wrong because the U.S. has troops there for our own security and not just for South Korean security. But the point is, I think the United States would have difficulty keeping any troops on the Korean Peninsula rather than be forward deploying them up to the Yalu River. We need to have a serious conversation with the Chinese about that. But I think also the problem is even deeper in China. If you consider a neighboring state, a tributary state of North Korea, somehow going down, it's a Marxist-Leninist state. It was a historical ally. There are Chinese who still go out to the grave of their grandfather who died in the Korean War and who pay homage to the fact that their grandfather or granduncle died there. Do you think they're just going to forget this all of a sudden, that there is no historical connection with the DPRK? No, I think the Chinese are going to worry that somehow having a Marxist-Leninist neighbor, a historical neighbor going down, would increase the tensions within China between the various groups who say we need to move faster on reform versus we need to move very slowly, which is where Xi Jinping is, that is to move very slowly. And if you have this change in the Korean Peninsula, how would it affect that domestic debate? In short, for Chinese, when they look at the Korean Peninsula, they don't see some distant security problem. They see a very real problem right in their neighborhood that affects their own internal politics. And so I think when Xi Jinping considers the whole difficulty of reforming China, he doesn't want to see the constellation of those forces, that is reform fast or reform slowly. He doesn't want to see that constellation affected by a change in the Korean Peninsula. So it's true that China worries about change, but they worry about change for their own internal reasons. And so I think the United States, again, needs to have a kind of serious discussion with the Chinese on this. Now, I must say, in the past, the U.S., when we'd get ready to have a serious discussion with the Chinese, we would have a negotiating process that looked a little like a Christmas tree. That is, everyone would want to put their little ornament on the tree so that when we'd start our negotiations, we'd take up every kind of issue. You name it, Tibetan rights, human rights in China, Uyghur rights, trade issues, all kinds of things. And frankly, over the years, the United States, because of the way our foreign policy has been organized, not spearheaded by even an NSC or a State Department, but rather by an interagency process, has had real trouble bringing focus to these discussions with the Chinese. So what President Trump has been doing is he's been looking at this situation in North Korea. He understands it's a serious problem, and a serious problem that could well be his problem in his first term. And so I think he's understood quite correctly the need to talk to the Chinese very directly about what needs to be done. And yet he's already encountered this resistance from China. That is, they're not quite ready to talk about what a North Korean demise would be. And so then President Trump, not wanting to be told that by his negotiating partner, whether it's the Carpenters Union in New Jersey or the Chinese government in Beijing. So he says, well, if you're not going to help, that's fine, we'll do it ourselves. And that's where the problem starts getting very big, because what in the world does he mean by we're going to do this ourselves? He seems to have, and he said it, his vice president has said it, his secretary of state has said it. They have good messaging, by the way, for the most part, although Nikki Haley is sometimes off in a different world. But with respect to you know, the defense secretary, the secretary of state, the vice president, and the president, I mean, they've made it very clear that, quote, everything's on the table. Well, first of all, you have to understand everything's on the table is kind of a poker metaphor that Americans use all the time. It's not really that earth-shattering that they would use this expression until you start kind of saying, okay, what do you really mean by this? And this is where it appears that what they mean is to have somehow an element that is on the table that could have the U.S. Preemptively attacking North Korea. They don't seem to want to rule that out. General Mattis has tried to walk that back, but the president has not tried to walk that back, and neither has the vice president tried to walk that back. So how would that work? We have in North Korea there's a nuclear facility called Yongbyon. That's not to be confused with Yongpyong in South Korea, where some of the downhill Olympic events will be next year. Yongbyon has no Olympic events. I've been there 3 times. And so the idea might be to strike the nuclear facility there. How we'd hit it, hard to say, because you know, we believe there's weapons-grade plutonium stored there. Do you really want to hit a facility that has weapons-grade plutonium? Bear in mind, we have no people on the ground. We haven't had any people on the ground there for almost for 8 years or so. So we don't really know where things are. And so hitting that particular thing, that facility, in order to destroy it and push the threat back from North Korea, a little bit problematic. I mean, it was one thing for that Norwegian and British commando team to go up and take care of that heavy water facility being done by the Germans here. And it's quite another thing to go in Yongbyon, where not only do they have they extracted plutonium, some 30 kilos, depending on who you believe, but the plutonium's there, and also we know that they've been making efforts at highly enriched uranium in Yongbyon. So hitting that is problematic. But then, what if the North Koreans decide to retaliate? Well, you could say, well, they won't want to retaliate because the U.S. would then retaliate against their retaliation. Well, maybe not. There are some 20 million South Koreans living within range of 14,000 North Korean artillery and missile launchers. So if the North Koreans shot some artillery, no question we would attack that artillery. The South Koreans have the mission of counter-battery fire. It's one of the most computerized and high-tech missions, but it does not necessarily stop an artillery shell from being launched. It probably will stop the second one from being launched. And it would hit a South Korean population center. So if the U.S. wants to strike North Korean nuclear facilities, it kind of has to do it with the South Korean government okay on that. And yet the South Korean government, looking at where its population is, might want to say, okay, but we need to evacuate 20 million people, which is, how to put it, not very practical. So we would find ourselves in a real problem if we ask the question, unless we're willing to live with that answer. And I don't think we would be. So if we don't ask them, and the North Koreans then hit fire artillery at these population centers, what would that do to the U.S.-South Korean alliance? I submit to you would kind of put that alliance back for decades to come. So I don't think there's any obvious scenario for preemption here. Could the U.S. be doing something in the way of cyber attacks? Not to be ruled out. And in fact, we know that the new generation of North Korean missiles have not had a very high success rate. For example, the solid fuel missile Musadon has had an 88% failure rate. So could we be doing something there already? It's possible. Should we do more in the future? Yes, definitely, in my view, because I think we could do that in the without triggering a North Korean response. But are we sure we would not trigger a North Korean response? No, we're not. So I think these kinds of direct attacks on North Korean facilities are quite problematic, and I think we need to think that through. Would the Chinese be willing to do something beyond doing what they have to do, which is to live up to the UN Security Council sanctions? I think China is going to do more in the Security Council sanctions. We've already seen some reactions in terms of not buying North Korean coal, although some of that may have been market-driven, but still that's an important step. They're also apparently not going to be shipping refined petroleum products to North Korea. North Korea does not have refineries. They require Chinese petroleum. So it's possible China can do something there. But I think the fact is that the North Korean nuclear program is moving faster than the effect of these sanctions could be. So the sanctions element is not going to be enough to dissuade North Korean behavior. So when you talk about working with China, we need to expect something more from the Chinese, and yet I don't think the Chinese are prepared really to activate, for example, elements in the KPA, the Korea People's Army, to somehow be disloyal. That's a tall order. That would be quite a difficult process for the Chinese, and they've never done anything like that before. So when President Trump and his team comes in and says this is urgent, no more strategic patience, we need to deal with this immediately, they have to answer the question, at least internally, what do they have in mind? And so far, what they appear to have in mind is to try to suggest that there could be a military response and hope that the North Koreans will take that to mean North Korea should get back to negotiation. Meanwhile, however, let's assess whether they would get back to negotiation. Would North Korea want to do that? North Korea in 2005 agreed in this joint statement of September 19th, 2005, they agreed to abandon all their nuclear weapons. Nuclear programs, rather, all nuclear programs, not just weapons, but all nuclear programs. It took a while to get this implemented, but by February 2007, almost 18 months later, we had an agreement where they would begin to disable some of their facilities. They would make it difficult to put the Yongbyon reactor back on track or back on in working condition. The United States and others agreed to provide them with some energy assistance, and so we were providing energy assistance, by the way, much to the consternation of the party that just elected Donald Trump president, because President Bush, who supported this approach, was severely criticized within the Republican Party for somehow talking to the North Koreans, and secondly, for giving them any kind of assistance. So there was a process going on, albeit very unpopular in the U.S., but also unpopular from what we can tell within North Korea, because by the summer of 2008, when we got to the key question of verification, it was clear the North Koreans were not prepared to allow any verification of sites that were not already declared in their own declaration. Now, North Korea had given a nuclear declaration that omitted any reference to highly enriched uranium. and only had the actual facilities around the Yongbyon graphite moderated reactor. So it was, so when we pressed for broader means to verify, we didn't even ask them to make a more honest declaration. We simply asked for a broader means to verify the non-existence of their nuclear program. The North Koreans essentially said no. There was speculation at the time that maybe the North Koreans were waiting for the new administration, that is the Obama administration, to come in. There's also speculation that Kim Jong-il, who in the summer of 2008 had become Kim Jong very ill because he had had a stroke in August. And so there's speculation, well, maybe the North Koreans are not getting the answers from their leader because he's incapacitated. Hard to say, but it was very clear they were not interested in verification. The Obama administration came in, there was no renewal of interest in verification, and so we essentially have not had any negotiations since 2008. So meanwhile, we have Kim Jong-un, who is Kim Jong-il's son, who has made pretty clear that he's not interested in any kind of negotiation. So we have, I think, a real problem that is going to require a number of solutions. It's going to require, first of all, a close U.S.-South Korean relationship. And that, by the way, is not going to be easy as South Koreans go to the polls next week to have their election. Their president, Park Geun-hye, was impeached. She's been in jail. She's begun a criminal prosecution. So they have an election which will probably bring Moon Jae-in into power. Moon Jae-in was the chief of staff of Roh Moo-hyun's presidency at the Blue House. Roh Moo-hyun was a kind of leftist president whose term of office ended in 2007. So Moon Jae-in is someone with well-known questions about the U.S. alliance and who believes that there should be more dialogue with the North Koreans. So one of the big issues, as the U.S. and South Korea have been busy trying to strengthen the alliance, including by providing South Korea with elements of an anti-ballistic missile system. I say elements because THAAD, as it's called, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, does not cover all of South Korea. So even the deployment of THAAD, which would not necessarily solve the problem but would be a start, is now being questioned by some of the Korean progressives who want to freeze the deployment or look at it and sort of take another look at the whole issue of how to manage North Korea. So I think President Trump is going to find he has a difficult task with if Moon Jae-in wins the election, and opinion surveys have him ahead today. He's going to have a difficult task if he thinks he can get China to take direct action against North Korea. China is divided on the question of North Korea, and while you can meet many business leaders in Shanghai who say we are done with North Korea, we don't want anything to do with them, for every business leader in Shanghai who feels that way, you can find some security type in Beijing who thinks they're a historical ally. And by the way, China doesn't want to open a lot of uncertainty on the Korean Peninsula right now. So I think it's going to be difficult to work with the Chinese. I think the U.S. is going to have to try to look for ways to slow down the program, whether it's through cyber or some other type of aggressive action between the space of war and peace. I think that has to be part of the solution. And I think overall there needs to be I won't call it strategic patience, but there needs to be an understanding that any solution here is going to require the careful choreography of several elements, and we just have to hope that this administration is up to that in terms of the wisdom it will take. I might add one more thing, and then maybe we could go to a more interactive process here, which is a lot of people say, hey, North Korea is an impoverished little country, and the reason they want these nuclear weapons is that it assures their regime survival. So come on, let them have some nuclear weapons. They can't really harm anyone. This is just about ensuring their survival. They don't mean any harm to anybody. Well, I would respectfully disagree with that view. And by the way, that view is strong, because you often hear people saying that the U.S. should engage in negotiations with North Korea whose purpose is to freeze North Korean weapons, that is, no more tests, and in return for a scaling down of the annual U.S.-South Korean military exercises. Well, first of all, I would argue that this is not what the North Koreans want nuclear weapons for. I would argue that their interest in nuclear weapons is for a much more aggressive purpose, and that is decoupling the U.S. ROK, U.S.-South Korean alliance. So you say, well, how could that work? Here's how it works, and you have to think like a North Korean for a minute to understand it. But it's basically the view, if you're a North Korean and you look at South Korea, you're convinced that half the South Koreans are really more sympathetic to North Korea than they are to those foreigners, the U.S. So you have a lot of support within South Korea for North Korea. This is the view that you hear from the North Koreans. And by the way, I heard this directly from some North Korean refugees. So if North Korea were to attack South Korea by conventional means, that would mean the U.S. would say, we're in. We are part of the U.S. ROK alliance, means we're in. We're at war with North Korea. And then the North Koreans say to the U.S., if you are in this fight, which is none of your business, it's between us and our brothers in South Korea, we will consider you an enemy and we will launch a nuclear strike against you. And then the U.S. says, well, wait a minute, you launch a nuclear strike against us and we will wipe out your country. You won't even want to put a parking lot on North Korea after we're done. And so then the question is, especially if you're a South Korean or if you're Japanese, do you believe that the U.S. would take a chance with having a nuclear strike in the lower 48 states, whether it's Los Angeles or someplace in the U.S.? Do you think a U.S. president would accept that possibility, that risk, in return for flattening North Korea? Would a U.S. president say, well, that's a good deal, Los Angeles for flattening North Korea? So if you're a South Korean or a Japanese, do you believe that? And so you can see how that decoupling process could begin to unfold if the North Koreans could credibly hold at risk U.S. targets. Now, you might argue, look, there's no way one of their multi-stage missiles could actually reach the U.S., let alone be targeted and hit an urban center. I don't know. They have successfully had multi-stage missiles. They seem quite intent on perfecting them. There were 25 missile tests in 2016. There have already been several in 2017. We know that they are experimenting with a new generation of missiles, especially solid fuel. And we know that they've got the technology to do multi-stage. And we know, too, that they've been experimenting with warhead designs with their, that is, miniaturization of these nuclear devices that they've tested five of them. So I don't think you could say necessarily that North Korea is not a threat to hit the U.S. mainland. So what would that mean for the U.S. relationship or U.S. alliance with South Korea? And without getting too far afield here, I don't want to take this too far, but think back to the INF controversy in the early 80s. Think back to the question of when the Soviets began to deploy SS-20s. There was a lot of concern that somehow an SS-20 against Europe would not necessarily trigger a U.S. strategic response, because the U.S. would be concerned that then the Soviets would use their own strategic arsenal against the U.S. And so you recall it was solved by putting in, or by essentially threatening to put in Pershings and Glickums, ground-launched cruise missiles. So again, there are a million differences between what's happening in North Korea and the intermediate force issues of early 1980s. But I think you can see that this could be a problem for us. And then just to mention the other day, Vice President Pence went and had a kind of fence-mending trip to Australia, and Prime Minister Turnbull said something nice about the U.S. and hoped that the U.S. can help solve the North Korean issue, whereupon the North Koreans immediately threatened Australia with a nuclear attack. So maybe they just want it for their own regime survival, and maybe all this other stuff is simply how they talk to people, because even brutal dictatorships have politics. But I don't necessarily feel that you could take that to the bank and not worry about it. So I think we have a real problem. And in the fullness of time, I think we need to slow down this thing, and I think slow down the North Koreans through some kind of cyber attacks of some kind. We need to slow that down. We need to sharpen the choices. We need to get China to see this more broadly than they do now. And ultimately, we need everyone comfortable with the idea that North Korea will probably in the fullness of time have to go away. So with those comments, maybe we can go to a more interactive format. And I don't know if I've answered enough about Donald Trump, because there's a lot more to say there.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
But I'm not asking for asylum.
I think you covered a lot of issues, and I think it was very nice that you spent a lot of time on the North Korea issue. Now we open the floor for comments, and we have a microphone here. So there's one over here. Please identify yourself when you ask the question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Pervis Soli Kasai. I'm a Central Board member of the Labour Party International Forum of Oslo. I have two questions regarding Japan and Russia in this.
Regarding Japan and Russia?
And Russia, yeah. Japan is a very important partner, and the recent opinion poll shows that the Japanese people want to change that constitution that the United States has written for them after the Second World War, and they want to militarize, and that is a good sign to have a balance of power in the region. And the second question is Russian role in here, because Russia is almost a neighbor of this, North Korea, from that strip down this Russian. So what is really, apart from what Russia is doing in the Security Council, what is the real strategic view of Russia or activities in this case with North Korea? Thank you.
I think, first of all, I can tell you from direct experience, having spent 4 years on the problem in the six-party talks, that Russia was not helpful in the six-party process. Now, I felt they should be helpful because their views were pretty much identical to our views, but I found them unwilling, really, to engage in a way that would kind of push the North Koreans to sharpen, to understand the choices involved. Russia did participate in the fuel supply and the providing of this heavy viscosity fuel that we sent to North Korea in return for the disablement of the nuclear facilities. They did participate in that, but there was very little effort that I could see from the Russians to try to do more. And so I would put them up as a big disappointment. Not to make light of it, but I think every country does things out of their national self-interest. I think Russia also does things out of their national self-interest, but the other element of their foreign policy is just pure spite. They just love doing things when it makes us annoyed. And so I think that was a big consideration in their participation in the six-party talks. With respect to Japan, I think Japan is going to move to remilitarize. I think that is happening. I think it is Abe's firm desire to do that. And I think they are encouraged in that by the United States, because the United States sees them as a good partner and ally, not only in areas in Northeast Asia, but also elsewhere. So I think the U.S. has been very encouraging. Myself, personally speaking, I think it's probably has to happen, but I would like to see a much more aggressive Japanese diplomatic effort to resolve issues from the past with Republic of Korea and China. I don't defend the Chinese and the way they often instrumentalize Japan and use Japan for their own internal politics. And by the way, this happens in South Korea as well. But I think to remilitarize or to move past the 1% barrier is a bold step and should be accompanied by much more diplomacy in the region. And I think it would be better accepted and understood if it had that. I think it's going to be a difficult time to do that if Moon Jae-in is the new president in South Korea. And being in Japan about 2 weeks ago, I was in a meeting with Abe, and I found there was a lot of concern about the outcome of the Korean election. So not good signs for the coming years.
Sverre, you can.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great pleasure to have you here and to listen to you. I think of what you said, the decoupling perspective, I dare say this is fairly new to the Norwegian setting. Although I am old enough to remember the INF issue and de Gaulle's verdict that only a national finger on the button would do. The United States doesn't sacrifice Chicago for Paris. And I think that analogy is valid.
Thank you, because I've only used it twice. This is the second time, so it's nice to get validation from a person as distinguished as you.
Thank you. While the North Korean ambition may then be more aggressive than we have traditionally been thinking, all the time security is of the essence for the North Koreans, security for the regime. And they stake it seems, increasingly on nuclear deterrence. And they make references to the fate of Gaddafi, Saddam, even Milosevic. And I can understand them. If you believe in what a big power is saying, you may end up blaming yourselves. Because a big state has the strength to do something different after all, if in the meantime circumstances have changed. And as Ukraine shows, even written security assurances may not do. And if I were to compare today's situation with, say, the situation in 2005, I have in mind the September joint declaration, then I would say it probably takes more to reassure the North Koreans today than at that time, because today the North Koreans would arguably look for a functional equivalent to the nuclear deterrence, to the nuclear capabilities. So I submit we have to think harder about that, how to reassure the North Koreans. And then, if I may move on to my question. Towards the end of Obama's presidency, the administration said, we are willing to sit down with the North Koreans without preconditions to discuss the preconditions for negotiations. With the Trump administration, we might hope that the Chinese would deliver the North Koreans to the negotiating table on conditions acceptable to the United States. And from Tillerson, I've heard different versions of what it takes. He's saying in one comment that North Korea has to step back from some of its nuclear capabilities in order for the United States to come to the table. And that might be, as you mentioned briefly, a freeze. It might be a full declaration, IAEA verification of the correctness of that. But then I also see that he is suggesting that first the North Koreans would have to do away with their weapons of mass destruction. And then the United States might sit down and talk with them. So what do you make of that?
You know, the practical reality is the following. If North Korea, having agreed to give up all their nuclear programs, and now saying they can't, they repudiate what they've already agreed to, and if they say to the U.S., we'd like to talk to you, the practical reality is they want to talk to us on the basis of one nuclear state to another. And those are not conditions we're prepared to accept. However, if the North Koreans came to us and said, look, we can't just say that we agree to denuclearization and then meet you, because then what's the point of meeting you? It makes us look like we're already, the negotiation's over even before we meet you. Here's how I would handle it as a professional diplomat. I would say, okay, North Koreans, do you agree that you're going to get back to the September 19th statement? Yes, but we can't do that before we even talk to you. It just looks like we've already capitulated. Okay, I would agree to some kind of process by which we say, okay, we'll meet in Beijing, we'll have 72 hours, 3 days, 5 days, whatever you want. But after that, we need an understanding that after that, you would say, on the basis of these negotiations, we've agreed once again to what we agreed to before. So if this is a question of the North Koreans feeling they're losing face and not wanting to go to a negotiation where they've already said publicly that somehow they've capitulated to what our demand is in the negotiation, then we simply approach them and try to work this out quietly. Maybe have the Chinese as the cutouts to say, the Chinese come to us and say, okay, they will agree to come, they will agree to the September statement, but only after 5 days or whatever. We're good. We can figure that out. And that happens all the time in diplomacy. But the real problem is they have not accepted to come back on the basis of denuclearization. They've only accepted negotiations as if they are somehow the Soviet Union and we are the United States, and we two great nuclear powers can now talk about it. So I don't think that's a basis for talking. The problem we have is, you know, even on a good day, Americans have very bad historical understanding. I mean, for us, you know, to talk about what happened last Tuesday is about as far back historically as we like to go. It's a problem. I mean, you know, we always like to think forward. And so with this current administration, they don't want to acknowledge anything that's happened before. And I think that's a problem not only for the continuity and the success of negotiations, it's also a problem for our other partners, Japan and South Korea and others. But if they want to come to us, they know our telephone number. They can reach us. We could have a discussion that would get back to abandonment of all nuclear programs. And we don't have to have them get on their knees and say it in the beginning. So, you know, I think we could do it. But I don't think they want it right now.
Okay, we have one question over here, but could I just ask one question? Because you said that in some sense the North Korean issue is piling up, is becoming a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have a U.S. administration that is, to be modest, as you said, they're kind of inexperienced. Or,
yeah.
And how do you see or assess the risk of misunderstandings, kind of accidents, kind of miscommunications that really leads us into some kind of really rather catastrophic event, and what is the kind of crisis mechanism in this situation?
Well, I think that risk is greater with inexperience. I'm particularly concerned about the notion that we might have, there may be a gap between a bluff and what we would really be prepared to do. If we have a carrier task force, carrier strike force, up in the East Sea, and North Korea says, okay, we'll have a nuclear test, and then the carrier task force simply, goes around in circles for a few days and then comes back, I find that kind of a dangerous situation as well. Maybe not as dangerous as us launching T-lands at North Korea for the reasons I outlined, but I think either way, it argues for not forward deploying such an asset unless you're prepared to use it. And I would not be prepared to use it at this time. So that's where I worry about the inexperience. And I don't think you can bluff your way, especially if you're a great power. I don't see how you can bluff your way through this. And so I'm a little worried about some of this tough talk.
Okay, thank you.
Given your expertise, would it be okay if I sidetracked you just for a moment to ask a question on Bosnia?
Sure, I love talking about Bosnia. It was actually a relative success, although no one in Bosnia agrees with that.
Well, that's actually one of my questions. It's the focus of my research at the moment. And oh, sorry, Kira Gallagher, University of Oslo. Yes, I was wondering that given your deep involvement both in the Balkans and in the actual brokering of the peace with Dayton, what would you attribute to explain how tense the peace is 2 decades later, and arguably how unstable it seems despite the duration of that negative peace?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, we can bring this up in contemporary terms in Syria too, because I think what is sadly lacking in Syria is a diplomatic way forward. Rather than talk about who we're going to arm in Syria, the Free Syrian Army, of which there are probably about 10 of them, rather than talk about which faction we should arm in Syria, I would like us to lay out what it is our goals are in Syria, and to try to get agreement from other powers, external powers, on what, do we want Syria and its international borders? I would say yes. Do we want Syria to have decentralization, maybe a canton system? I would say yes. Do we want Syria to have a rotating presidency because the Alawites can't be controlling Syria with 15%? I would say yes. Do we want Syria to have maybe some demarcation lines such that militias cannot cross those lines and then have some international force to prevent that? Yes. I could do this in the back of a used envelope on Syria. And the reason I start by talking about Syria in answer to your question is, what was Dayton? Dayton was not we didn't create a peace in Dayton. What we did was implement a peace plan that had already been laid out by something called the Contact Group Plan. Bosnia shall exist within its international borders. Bosnia shall consist of 2 entities, a federation and a Srpska Republika. Bosnia shall have 3 presidents, or however we did it. It's all in the Contact Group Plan. So what Dayton really was an implementation of that plan. And so the problem of Dayton was not that we felt that there should not be citizens, and that people should enjoy their constitutional rights insofar as they're a member of the 3 communities. We didn't say that. But that's how the Bosnians have interpreted it over the years. I mean, if you're a Turkish ethnic Turk from Bosnia, what community do you therefore express your political rights through? The Serb community? Probably not, etc. So I think the problem has been in the implementation of Dayton, and especially among the Bosnians in how they implemented it. and with too much literalism and not a capacity to make the adjustments. And I think they've also, the idea of Dayton was simply you could not have the Bosnians and the Croats gang up on the Serbs and change things. You had to do it by consensus. And frankly, how do you get someone to do something they don't want to do? You give them something else that they want. So you use a little what's called politics. And so I think the Bosnians have failed to do that and instead have fallen back on a time-honored tradition. When in doubt, blame a foreigner. When in doubt, blame the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when in doubt about that, you can always get away with blaming the Ottoman Turks. So I think there's this excessive tendency to blame foreigners for their predicament and not enough honesty to look at themselves. And I know it hasn't gone all that well, but I would recall to your attention 200,000 people were killed in that war. And so I see this now in Syria. Oh, we can't be telling the Syrians what to do. That's so patronizing. Well, when you've engaged in a civil war that's cost upwards of 200,000 civilians their lives, you have kind of lost the right to talk about being patronized. I'll make one other point because I think it's important. You know, one of the things the Americans did in 2012, I think now, was the idea that we said Assad must go. Well, why do we say Assad must go? Because there was a perception in the U.S. papers, U.S. newspapers, et cetera, that we were too slow to say Mubarak must go. A little too slow. I mean, after all, this miserable dictator, he was still there, and we still had people saying, well, you know, he'd done some good things for us. We let the Egyptian people kind of sort that out in an election. So, as if to answer the question of why we were so slow in getting rid of him, we thought we'd be a little too fast in getting rid of Assad. And I think it's hurt us big time because we have not been able to engage on all the sides in Syria because we can't engage with the government in Damascus. And it's very reminiscent. On the last day of the Dayton Peace Accords, Holbrooke and I went to see Milosevic, and we told Milosevic that Karadzic and Mladic must go. And Milosevic said, how can you say that? Those are Serbs. The Serbs need to do that. We've set up these elections. You know, you shouldn't be ordering that some people can't participate. Let the people determine that. And we said, sorry, we're not going to put $1 into this process unless we get these war criminals out of the process. And so Milosevic looked over at the stacks of papers that constituted the Dayton Peace Accords and realized that we had done 99% of the process and said, okay, you're making a mistake, but okay, they're out of the process. So with Syria, 0% of the process has been done, and we tell the Damascus government that Assad must go. 0%, with 0% of anything done, we say he must go. It's not serious, and it came from people who simply don't understand that even scruffy, miserable little places like Syria have some sense of dignity and some sense that they have some rights, and we ought to be more respectful of that.
Thank you so much. Now I have we have 5 minutes left. So first there, and then the question, and then if I have time, here as well. But you should be very brief, please.
Briefer than I was on that, but I
no,
wanted to pick
good.
up the Syria thing.
Yeah. Brynjar Skjærli from newspaper VG. I return to North Korea, if it's okay. When you have this new approach from the new administration, how do you think that the North Koreans are, or how do you think that is affecting the North Korean leadership?
Well, they're obviously looking at it very carefully. They love playing cards. They do that all the time. And so they're probably thinking, is this a bluff? Does this new president bluff? Does he follow through on all his actions? So they're asking questions like that. They're also getting a lot of pressure from the Chinese, not directly because they don't really have a good dialogue right now, but they're hearing a lot from the Chinese. We understand that last missile test, which blew up immediately within a few seconds of taking off, was actually blown up by the North Korean missile testers. It wasn't a cyber attack or something. So they might be thinking we needed to test the engine to see if it'll work, if it'll get off the launch pad, and then once that's successful, we can blow it up because it doesn't matter. And by blowing it up, we prevent the possibility of a retaliation strike by the U.S. So they may be thinking in those terms. But I think it's, in my view, a little dangerous to try to expect the North Koreans to do the right thing, because I just don't think they can be relied on for that.
Karsten.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at the Institute. Thank you for excellent talks. I would like to comment on Trump in more general. We had Michelle Forner here a few days ago.
Yeah.
And her two of the concerns she had. She shared a lot of the views that you have expressed, I think. But first of all, she said that lots of decentralization. The Kerry group I just talked about, it wasn't decided in the White House. It was decentralized to the Navy. Same with the bomb in Afghanistan was the decision made in somewhere. So it's not strategic decision. It's actually you don't know really what's happening. Yeah. That's one concern. The other concern she said was that her main concern was the ability for the administration to handle a big crisis. Any administration will handle a big crisis, and they don't have the ability or the manpower to do so. Would you share some of that?
Yeah, I completely agree with her. From what we can understand of that bomb the Moab bomb in Afghanistan, that was a local decision, and President Trump was simply using that to. He's not so much being a former businessman; he's being a former reality TV host, and taking something and trying to make it into something that it wasn't. So I completely agree with her, with Michelle. I think a big part of the problem is they're not staffed up, so the sort of synapses between these muscles are just not operating right now. And so they're not, their capacity to coordinate things is not what it should be. Question, will it get better? Is this simply a question of, once Tillerson and Mattis, fill out their staffs, will everything be okay? I don't think so. And I think that goes to the fact that we have a president who's really not sure what he should be involved in or what he should not be involved in, nor is he sure what he should talk about and what he should not talk about. Will a person of that age learn new tricks and learn how to do things right? I don't know. So I think there are problems in terms of how they could manage a crisis, because I don't think they have the experience and the synapses between organizations to manage a crisis. So I would, as often is the case, fully agree with her.
Very briefly then.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm the Egyptian ambassador here.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you very much for your rich conversation. But very quickly, since there's so much going on, Syria, now North Korea, and so on and so forth, do you expect the Middle East to be a priority on the Trump's administration agenda? And should we expect any initiative in that regard? Thank you.
So far, the answer is no. I would say the attack on Assad's on the airfield was more an attack on Obama and his red lines. I think that was the point. In military, you can use force to support diplomacy, or you can use support for punitive purposes, maybe to reimpose deterrence. And I think it was the latter case rather than the supporting diplomacy. Now that said, Tillerson said he wants to talk to the Russians and see what can be done diplomatically. I don't have the sense that much has been done up till now on that, nor do I have the sense of an administration getting away from its central pillar of dealing with ISIS to dealing with the question of Syrian state succession. And as you know better than I, there are essentially two wars going on in Syria. There's ISIS, and then there's Syrian state succession. And I don't see a capacity to deal with Syrian state succession right now. I'm also a little concerned by the fact that on his first trip over, he's going to be talking to the Saudis. I think there needs to be a much better understanding of how the Saudis and Iran are managing things, managing their own problems, and I don't think there is. I think there's too much of this idea the Saudis are our friend, the Iranians are our enemies. And I would argue the Saudis have had grave concerns about the Iran nuclear deal, not because of the nuclear deal, but because they think we're going back to the future. We're going back to the 1970s when our dance partner was the Shah of Iran, and that somehow what we see now with this U.S. stuff with Iran is going back to that period. Never mind that Ayatollahs are not the same as the Shah of Iran, et cetera. I think that's how the Saudis look at it. And I think it's completely wrong, but I don't see the Trump administration knowing how to handle that very well. And I don't think allowing them to bomb Yemen mercilessly is the way to solve Saudi anxiety about Iran. Yeah.
Excellent. I don't know, do you have a time for one more question?
Sure, I'm fine.
All the way to the back there. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspectives. One over here towards the end. Thank you.
Ole Peder with ABC Nyheter, a local newspaper. I was wondering about what you said toward the end of the speech proper regarding the current capability of North Korea to reach mainland targets in the United States. That it is uncertain and we just don't know.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how certain a confirmation would the current administration need before their hands would be forced to do something?
Yeah. You mean if North Korea had a demonstrated capability to launch multi-stage missiles at a distant target, the U.S., and if they stood up a missile in a launch pad where there might be a nuclear warhead attached, what would we do? And I think what you're saying, that scenario is one that I think is going to be upon us in the next few years. And at some point, I think an American president has to say, we will take it out. Very fateful moment because of the fact that these 20 million South Koreans are in range, et cetera, and this is something we have to work with the South Koreans on. But at some point, I think an American president has to respond to that kind of threat. It's not there right now. I mean, we don't have evidence that they've made warheads yet. And we don't have evidence that they have a missile with a demonstrated capacity to reach the United States. We don't have that evidence. But I think that is coming in the next few years, and I don't see how an American president can just not do anything. And I might add that I don't see how Donald Trump can face the American people in 2020, which is, still 1,320 days, but who's counting? I don't see how he can face the American people and say, well, I didn't know what to do about that problem. It turned out to be more complicated than I thought, so I just decided not to do anything. I don't see how he can say that. So that's why I think it really is a looming crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that your thoughts and perspectives on both the Trump administration, but also the North Korea issue has been...
It's a good two administrations to pair up with. Oh, no.
Yeah, and also on the Middle East, you said a lot of things. But in addition to that, I think there are some very important takeaway points apart from these specific regions. And what I have noted is that I think it came clear throughout your speech that the importance of the deep understanding of the complexities on the ground, the different sets, etc., and the importance of knowledge and expertise. The second is the importance of allies and working close with the allies, and the importance of predictability in foreign policy and in diplomacy in general. I also heard that you were quite concerned about diplomatic activity as being driven by ideology. And then, of course, I think the overall kind of speech had been a testimony to some of the strengths of diplomacy and the importance of diplomacy. Even though we don't always reach the results, it's probably better than non-diplomacy.
Yeah. Right? I'd like, there's one other point I should have mentioned, which is in that September 19th, 2005 joint statement, which I hope some of you will Google or whatever you do here. I sat down with the North Koreans. Sung Min Soon, the South Korean, sat down with the North Koreans. Wu Da-wei, the Chinese, sat down with the North Koreans. And in separate meetings, we said, what do you want? What is it you want? And so I wrote it all down. And by the way, it wasn't easy to sell these things. I mean, there was a vice president at the time named Dick Cheney who, you know, hated me and hated a lot of us who were working on it. So it wasn't easy to sell, but we said they seem to want a security guarantee, no attack by conventional or nuclear means. They seem to want energy assistance. They seem to want economic assistance. They seem to want cross-recognition of states, and they seem to want a peace treaty to replace the sort of elaborate ceasefire we had. So all of those elements I sent back to Washington. I talked to Wu Da-wei, to Sung Min Soon. We agreed these need to be the elements that we will give to the North Koreans in return for denuclearization. And it was a big to-do in Washington. But they agreed. And then we did all this, and the North Koreans walked away. And I think I reluctantly come to the conclusion they want something else. And the something else, I think, is this decoupling.
Excellent, thank you. I guess all of you would agree that it would be a very wise choice to spend the time here instead of enjoying the spring sun. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.